Hello friends, and welcome to this beginner's course on React. And this is one of the first lessons where we're actually going to use React for real. What I want you to do is just create yourself a brand new file in your favorite text editor, and I'm using Notepad on Windows, but any other text editor of course is just as good. So I'm creating myself an index.html file. It's literally empty, as you can see, and we're going to do some React in here. So we're going to create a very simple React page here. You're going to be amazed at how little lines we need to be able to initialize React. And of course we're going to do a very simple hello world, as everyone does when they're just starting out on learning something new. But don't worry, we're going to quickly progress our knowledge through this course. Okay, let's get started. So in the top of your file, because it's going to be a throwaway file, we're not going to worry about all the HTML syntax. We're just going to do the very basics, what we need. So let's have a script tag, and the source is going to be https unpkg or unpackage.com, and then React. And we're going to currently use the version 17 that's currently available at the time of writing this course. UMD React development.js, and then end it with a script like this. And then we're going to have another script tag, so just copy and paste this one, and then where it says React here, just change it, put a hyphen and then put React-DOM, and then where it says React here, put another hyphen and then React-DOM like this. Perfect. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create ourselves a very simple div above this. So let's do div id equals root, and then finish off the div. Lovely. And then we're going to create one more script tag underneath, to script, finish the script tag, and inside that we're going to do const hello React create element. It needs to be a capital E, so lowercase c and then capital E for element. Make sure you spell elements correctly. And then a brackets, speech marks, h1. So we're going to put h1 tag, close off the speech marks, comma, and then open and close a curly brace. And then we're going to have a string. Let's put hello, and then a semicolon at the end. So that's the first line, and the second line is going to be React DOM, and DOM is in capitals, so capital D, O and M, then render. Then we're going to render this hello that we've got just created above, so hello. And then this is where the magic happens. We're going to use a normal DOM and then do DOM selector, and we're going to select the ID here, or the div, and we're going to render our React in this div here. That's the location. This div here is effectively acting as a placeholder for our React component. So let's put DOM, not put DOM, let's put document. Let's spell it correctly, document, and then get element by ID, and then we're going to select the root element. Okay, let's give that a save. So I've called that index.html. So in my Windows Explorer, I've got this file I've created, just this one here, and we can simply open that up in a normal browser and drag that guy in. And there we go. As soon as I do that, we can see the word hello in H1. So that, friends, is React in a nutshell, and that's all you need to open up React. As you can see, it's very minimal. So the div here is basically a placeholder where React will look to mount our components or our app. And then of course we need to import in React, of course. And then we've got this second import here, React DOM. Now React, as mentioned in the introduction, can be rendered on not just the web but also things like mobile and other different devices, etc. So the React DOM effectively allows it to render with a web browser And of course, if you're using something like React Native, then you wouldn't need to include this. You would include a different import. These are the two lines we need for our React in a web browser. Just for simplicity, we're using this in the CDN and effectively downloading it from this website, unpackage.com, just for the demo purposes. And when you're doing React development for real, you're more likely to bring it in from a package manager like npm or yarn, for example. And we're going to cover that in a few lessons time. So once we've got that, we're creating ourselves a constant. So we're asking React to create an element called h1. That's the h1 that we can see on our page here. And then we're using the word hello. And don't worry about this empty brackets for the time being. And then we're asking our React DOM, which is coming from this import here, to render our element hello. And we're asking our React DOM to render our element hello and locate it or mount it in the placeholder marked with div ID root. Okay, so that is it for a very quick demo, and I hope you're excited to learn more. So in the next lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to migrate away from Notepad because, as I said, very much a throwaway file. We're going to develop our first project in CodePen to keep things simple. Okay, see you there. In this video, we are going to look at the tools that we need to start our React development. If you are already a JavaScript developer, there's a very good chance that you have these tools already installed on your machine. So what do we actually need? Well, we only need two actual tools, one of which is Node.js. Node.js is available for all the platforms, Windows, Mac and Linux. If you don't already have it on your machine, then just follow the download link and run the appropriate installer. The other tool that you're going to need will be a code editor. There are some very good code editors out there, including Sublime. And one of the code editors that I would recommend is Visual Studio Code. It's free, it will run on all the platforms, including macOS and Linux. So just follow the download link and get that installed. Okay, that's pretty much it that we need to install on a machine. So get them installed if you haven't already, and let's crack on with the next video. Hello and welcome friends back to another lesson, and in the previous lesson we created a very simple React demo with a few lines of code in our favourite text editor. Now what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to graduate away from our Notepad because it's not the best environment for writing React scripts, and for the first project we're going to use CodePen. Much later on in the course we're going to use Visual Studio Code to do our React development, but just for now let's use CodePen. So I want you to go to codepen.io and then click on Start Coding button here, and when you do that you should see you've got three windows. We've got an HTML window here, a CSS window and a JS or JavaScript window, and in this bottom part down here you effectively get a live render. So every time I make a change, and let's just put something in here saying p hello, oops, like this, you can see it immediately, or after a few seconds, updates a little browser window here. So it's a very handy little site for doing quick little mock-ups and stuff like that, and perfect for our first project, which will be our calculator. So let's take the code that we've did in our index file and let's paste that straight into this HTML here. And when we do that, you can see that it updates and we get exactly the same output as we got in our browser window before, but we can now make changes. So let's just change that from hello to hello React, and if we wait a moment it's going to update the browser window. So you can see why this site is particularly handy for very quick development and not having to bother going through and refreshing a browser, for example. Now, to make things easier for ourselves, rather than having this script in here, what we can do in this CodePen is we can go to our settings, then click on JS, and you can see that we can basically give it the imports that we've got in our HTML file here and then specify it. So it makes our HTML look a lot nicer. So let's do that. So let's take our path here. Whoops. Let's select all of this, include, go to settings and paste it into there. And we're going to do the same thing for the second one. So let's take the string up to this point, go to settings and paste it in there. Okay, so we've got our two imports. Now we can click close, and if we do that we can get rid of these script tags because they're going to be already included in the settings. And it's going to disappear just for a moment because what we need to do next is take our script from the script tag here and paste it where it says JS over here and get rid of the script tag over here. And then when we do that, you can see we get our hello React back again. So this is a much nicer way of doing things, I think anyway, to separate our HTML from our JS and utilize the settings here. Now for the next change, what I want you to do is where we've got React create elements, I want you to get rid of this line here, delete it, and then put h1 and then hello React and then a backslash h1 and get rid of the semicolon. And then you can see that nothing happens. So am I losing my mind completely? Why on earth have I put HTML in this JavaScript here? Well, just hold on just a moment and I shall show you some magic. So we're going to go to settings and we're going to change where it says JavaScript preprocessor. We're going to change it to Babel or Babel, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I call it Babel, but some people call it Babel, and who cares really how you pronounce it. And as soon as I hit close, you can see that magic happens and suddenly we have our Hello React text back. So what is going on? How did this magically work? And just to prove I'm not completely losing my marbles, let's go back to settings and change that back to none. And you can see that it is now broken again. So what is going on with this Babel, or whatever it's called, magic thing, that suddenly makes our HTML here in JavaScript start working? Well, that is something, my friends, that we call JSX. JSX? What is JSX? Well, let's find out in the next lesson and I shall tell you all about it. See you then. Okay, so in the last lesson we touched very briefly upon this special way of making HTML inside some JavaScript. What is this strange black magic? Well, this is called JSX. And JSX gives us the ability to put HTML inside JavaScript. And that's pretty much it, really. But it's very convenient, as you can see. If we don't use JSX, we have to do what we did in the previous lesson, using all that funky React DOM create element jazz. That gets very annoying very quickly. So I strongly recommend that you adopt JSX because it gives you a very comfortable way of being able to make your code a lot cleaner and easier to understand. But of course, our web browsers don't actually understand JSX. And we saw that in the previous video where we went to our settings and we changed it from Babel here back to none, and that quickly broke our site. So what is this superhero called Babel? So Babel, and if I take you to the website here, that's babeljs.io, you can read all about it. Babel allows us developers to use new features available in JavaScript that's not currently supported in any of the browsers. Babel effectively acts as a form of translation, I suppose. It translates between the new features and spits out plain old JavaScript that any browser can understand. And that's what allows us as developers to use the new funky features. And one of those funky features that we can use is JSX. Now, if you do a Google search for JSX, you're going to go to the main reactjs.org site. And I strongly suggest that you spend a lot of time looking through the various documentation on React because you'll pick up a lot of the basic concepts very quickly. If you go to this page here, introducing JSX, you can read all about what it is and why it exists, and a lot of the benefits that it gives to us. One of the main benefits is the ability to not only just to embed HTML inside our components and make our code a lot cleaner, but it also does something like it prevents injection attacks. That is very useful for us as developers. Let me quickly show you, going back to our pen here, one of the nice things you can do. So at the moment we've only got a little bit of HTML here, but let's say for example we want to nest our HTML with some surrounding HTML. And to do that we need to create a multi-line JSX. We surround it in these brackets and then press enter and make sure that your brackets is on the same line here. So what we can do is simply just nest our HTML in the normal fashion like you would in an HTML document. and it's going to work in exactly the same way. So that's pretty nice. Now if you take the brackets away like this, you're going to get an error. Now one of the other features you can do, which is very nice, is you can put JavaScript expressions inside this JSX. Let me show you what I mean by that. So if we create ourselves a constant, let's say name, and let's set it to Bob, then where we've got hello React here, we can simply output our name. So we can say hello React, and then hello name, and we need to surround our variable or our JavaScript in these little curly braces here. Some people call them curly braces, some people call them mustaches, and some people even call them handlebars. But they're effectively the same thing, so they are the little curly brace brackets. As you can see, that's a very nice little feature, and embedding JavaScript inside the HTML via JSX is one of the things you'll be doing a lot of while you're doing React development. Okay, so that's pretty much it for a very quick introduction to what JSX is and how it can help us as React developers. So with that, let's move on to the next video. Okay, so far we've managed to make this a very simple React example to output the words hello React to our output here. What we're going to do next is turn this into a functional component in order to start building our very first project, which will be a very basic calculator. At the moment, this is a simple React expression with some JSX. It's not a functional component. Firstly, what is a functional component? Well, a functional component is exactly how it sounds. It's a React component that consists of a function which contains some functionality and will output some JSX. Now that's the important thing to bear in mind, is that it must return some JSX for React to be able to render it. So let's start building a functional component. So what do we need for that? Well, let's get rid of what we've got here and create a simple function called hello. And that function is function hello. We're going to take no parameters for the time being, like this, and we are going to return some JSX like we've done before. So return h1 hello React, like this. We are waiting for CodePen to actually output our React component, but we're suddenly finding that nothing happens. So what's going on here? The first thing to do in this CodePen here is we have access to a console down the bottom here. So if you click the button here saying console, you can see we get a warning saying functions are not valid as a React child. This may happen if you return a component instead of a component with a tag like this from render, or maybe you meant to call this function rather than returning it. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're actually trying to render a function. We're not actually executing a function, and we're certainly not returning any element. So how do we fix this? Well, one way of fixing it is simply to execute the function by putting some brackets around it like this. And as soon as we do that, we can see that we get the words hello React, so the function is being called. But we actually want to make it into a component, not as a function. So this is not the right way to do it, okay? So let's get rid of the brackets here. And instead, what we need to do, we need to be able to turn this into an element, like this. And now, React thinks that it is an element. But we get another error on the screen saying the tag is unrecognized in this browser. If you meant to render a React component, start its name with an uppercase letter. So in React, all components must start with a capital letter in order for it to understand that we're not trying to render some crazy HTML tag here. We're actually trying to render a custom component, like a custom tag effectively. So a custom component in React is effectively a custom HTML tag. So let's turn this hello here into a lowercase and make that uppercase, and then change where we've got lowercase here to uppercase. Let's clear the browser, and immediately we get no errors appearing, and we get our text saying hello React. And just to double check that we're not actually getting errors, let's just add an extra word here, like hello, hi. And now we're getting it rendering, and now we can see that we get the actual updated text. So all is good. The key thing to bear in mind about functional components, as I've already mentioned, is it's very important that our function returns some JSX like this. It can return some JSX, or it could actually return another functional component, etc. And that could also return another functional component. So it doesn't have to be as basic as this, it could be a lot more sophisticated, and we will certainly be increasing our sophistication of our components as we proceed through this course. Now I'm just going to show you one other way of creating functional components in React. At the moment we've got this straightforward JavaScript way of producing a function. And the other way we can do it is to make ourselves an arrow function. We're going to do a create a constant. It's going to have no parameters. And we're simply going to output our h1 here. We can use an arrow function to basically return our JSX. And don't forget, when we're doing an arrow function, this symbol here, or this combination of symbols here, is basically doing the same thing as doing a return. If we want to do some nested JSX, maybe we want to wrap our h1 tag with another HTML tag, we can do a bracket around this here. And we can do another thing, something like div here and div there. We've now created a multi-lined JSX functional component. It's as simple as that. You can choose which way of producing a functional component as you prefer. Some people prefer the more traditional way of using JavaScript functions. Either way, it doesn't really matter. I tend to prefer using the arrow functions, but yeah, it's simple enough just to convert them to JavaScript functions if that's your particular style. Okay, let's take a little break here, and I shall see you in the next lesson. Okay, before we start developing functional components, it'll be very useful to have a very quick discussion about exactly what functional components are, because React encourages us to create functional components. So let's use a typical website that we probably all know, which is Amazon. Let's look at the web page here and determine what could be candidates for making into components. So components make building blocks of our website. In most websites, there is a lot of reuse. So for example, these little squares here are candidates for being a component. The only difference is it will display a different product. Let's draw a box around everywhere where we might think it might be a component. So one here, for example. Now this one over here, which is a much larger box, that's definitely going to be another component because it's reused down here. Then we've got a section down here. I think the whole of this rectangle will be a one component for holding the trending deals. And inside of it, it's going to have some children components for each of the products inside of here. And then we've got the same thing down here. We've got lightning deals. So the chances are that this trending deals and the lightning deals are the same components, albeit a little bit customized for whether it's trending or lightning deals. And once again, we've got reuse of components because we've got components around each of these products here. And as we scroll down the page, we can see more candidates for making components. We've got components around these gift ideas here, which is also reused in each of these sections. Once again, we've got another rectangle, which is probably another copy of the component that we've got up with the lightning deals. So basically, by looking at any website, you can see how the website's constructed using this component-based idea. It's almost like making a house or a building. The components are like having bricks on a building. Gradually, as you get more and more of them, you start to create quite complex websites. And another component right at the very top here could be the search bar, for example. How are we going to use the component with our calculator? Let's go to our calculator, and I will show you how the components are constructed. How are we going to use this component-based idea to build up our calculator? The calculator itself is going to be one master component, and inside of that we're going to have a series of buttons. Each of the buttons will be the same component, just customized to hold a particular number. So we've got the components at the top of here to be able to display the results. So altogether we've got 1, 2, 3. 3 components to make up this application. Okay, I thought it's worth being able to have a quick discussion about components, as you may be wondering why they are used in React. Okay, with that, let's move on to the next lesson. In the previous lesson, when we built our functional component, We learned that we have to start it with a capital letter, and we also have to return another component or some JSX. We also learned that we could build it using this arrow function style, or we could build it using a more traditional function like in JavaScript. What we're going to do in this lesson is I'm going to introduce you to the concept of props or properties in React. In order to build up some useful functionality with our component, we need to be able to have a mechanism that allows us to pass some information from a parent component down to our child component. And that concept in React is known as prop parsing. So what does that actually mean? Well, where we declared our components here, our component hello, we can provide some arguments to our child. For example, let's provide a property called name, and let's set it to the value of Bob. Okay, very good. Now, how do we actually get our child to do something with that? Well, every single functional component in React gets sent the props as a parameter. So where we've got a bracket here, we can simply put in props here, just like that. Okay, and now once we've got hold of our props, that comes in as a JSON object, and we can simply just output the property that we want from this props object. And of course, we need to put it inside our curly braces or our mustaches. So we do something like props.name. And now we can see that we get the output, hello React, hi Bob. Now it doesn't matter how many properties we pass it. So we could pass another one, maybe the Bob's age. Let's say Bob is 10 years old. So let's create a property called age. If we are passing not a string, but maybe any other primitive, for example, a integer or a float or a boolean, we need to be able to put those values not in single quotes, but in more mustaches or curly braces. So our age property is defined like this. We've got age and then a value of 10 inside our curly braces here. And now we can say something like, hi Bob, you are 10 years old. So let's put that in, just like that. And in the moment when it refreshes, we can see that we get, hi Bob, you are 10 years old. So that's pretty cool, right? So you can pass in all sorts of things using React, not just primitives like strings and booleans and integers, but we can also pass things like functions and even objects like a JSON object. Just to show the React actually reacting to the changes of properties, let's change the property name from Bob to maybe John and the age to maybe 11. Now we can see that the message is updated and we get the new values of the properties being passed through. So that's good, right? So that's how we pass in properties from a parent component down to a child. And we can keep on passing it down the chain. So we could have another child component inside our components here, and we could then pass the properties further down the chain. Okay, I just wanted to give you a very quick introduction to the world of properties and how useful they are in our React development. So with that, let's go on to the next lesson. We have already discussed how React uses a component-based design approach, where we build up an app using reusable components. The app component is the root component, which is mounted in the actual DOM by React. The rest of the application is then made with child components underneath this root app component. So in this way, a components tree is constructed. This is in a similar way to how the HTML DOM tree is constructed within a browser, with the main body node and other HTML elements underneath it. The whole reason for these components is to encourage component reuse if they are used in other parts of the application. For example, we might have some list component, as we can see here, that can be used in two different places in the application. This might be the same component with exactly the same code, but it will have a different instance and therefore different data and properties. We're now going to concentrate on how a parent component communicates with a child component, using this example here of authors and list. We are now going to concentrate on how a parent communicates with a child component, using the example of a parent author component here and a child list component here. We are now going to concentrate on how a parent component communicates with a child component by using the authors components that we have here as a parent and the list component underneath it as a child component. Alright, so in React, data flows between a parent component, shown here as authors, and a child component, shown here as a list, with a one-way mechanism known as props. Data does not flow back from the child component to the parent component via any properties. By this, the parent component is responsible for managing the properties of the child. The child cannot modify its properties that are passed to it. So let's have a look at some example properties. The child component is declared as a list component, as can be seen by the capital L, and then the properties are set as simple attributes similar to HTML attributes. These can be simple primitives, arrays, JSON objects, and even functions. Okay, so we just saw how a parent component communicates to a child component using the mechanism of props. So how exactly does a child communicate back to the parent component? It does this using a notion of callback functions. The parent component defines a function that should receive the notification from the child component. It then passes this function as an argument as a prop on the child component declaration. This is a special kind of prop, a function prop. So we can see here that we have defined an onLoad function on the parent, and we have a prop on the child with a similar name referencing the function on the parent. This is effectively passing the function as a callback to the child. When the child wishes to communicate back to the parent component, it will call the function on the prop with any parameters that it would like to pass back as a callback function. And you can see how we could do this in code. We check for the presence of the prop on load, and then if it's present, we simply can call it with any parameters that we need. So this circular motion is known in React as props forward callback. This mechanism is widely used in React development, so you're going to need to get very comfortable using it. In the next video, let's fire up CodePen and do a little demo of this mechanism in action. Okay, let's get started with our first project, which is our basic calculator. We're going to remove our hello component and make ourselves a very basic component called calculator. And I'm going to do this as a standard JavaScript function rather than an arrow function. Okay, so we started off with a function calculator. And of course, we need to return some JSX first of all in order for React to be able to render it. So let's first of all simply create a div and put the words hello in it. And of course, we need to actually be able to pass our calculator component through to our React DOM here. So let's get rid of the properties that we've got here and change it from hello to calculator. Okay, so now we've got a word hello appearing on our output. So we've just started off with our first calculator. Perfect. Okay, and next let's try and put a button on the screen instead of this word hello here. Let's do button with a value of 1 for the first button on a calculator, and just close off the button tag like this. And now we get a button of 1 appearing on the screen. Perfect. So of course we can take this button and we can reproduce it a few times. 1, 2, 3, and we should get 3 buttons appearing on the screen. And there we go, we've got 3 buttons on the screen. You can already see how we're starting to repeat ourselves by having this button here. So this will be perfect to be able to start creating ourselves our first child component to actually output this button. So let's do that. So let's do function, and let's call it calc button. And of course we need to return some JSX. So let's do return. Let's go button, and let's put a value in it just for now, like this. And let's remove these buttons here. And we're simply going to take our calculator button here and do calc button, which is the name of our function components that we've just made. And let's now do that 3 times. And in a moment we should get 3 number buttons appearing on the screen, exactly as we've done before. But it's not very useful, just hard code it with the value 1. So now we need to be able to pass in the value through to our calculator button. In a couple of lessons ago, we learnt about the existence of the props mechanism. So we can utilize that to be able to pass a value in. So let's do props. On the value of our button, we can say props.value. And where we actually use the components here, we can create a property called value. And we can set it to a number that we want. Let's set it to value 1. And let's do the same thing for the other 2 buttons. Okay, and now we have our 3 buttons, and we've successfully managed to pass in the value from our property here. We defined a property called value, we've set it to the number that we want, and it's going to get automatically included on this props object being passed to our child functional component. And then we can simply output it as a property of this props here. Lovely. Okay, let's change these values to the actual top row of our calculator, which would be 7, 8, and 9. 7, 8, and 9. And now what we want to do is start to put some little bit of CSS just to make our calculator look a little bit nicer. So let's do that. And all we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste the CSS that I've already defined as part of this course, just to save ourselves doing a lot of typing. Because we're going to put some CSS and we don't need any more HTML, we can minimize this HTML window by dragging it to the left, and this will give us a little bit more space to work with the CSS. So what I want to do first of all is define a container to hold our calculator. So we're going to put div around the calculator, and then we're going to just simply set the width to 400 pixels and the height to 400 pixels. We're going to do that with a little bit of CSS, so width here and height, and we're going to put a class on our div here. Now one thing to bear in mind is normally we would just put class like this on HTML, but for class in React is a very special keyword, and most of the HTML attributes can be used exactly as is in React, but class is not one of them. For class, what we have to do instead is say class name in camel case like this. When we put class name in camel case, what that will do is it will then translate it in the background to the normal HTML class. So let's put app container like this, and we still get our 3 buttons. But if we open up our console and we inspect that button down here, we can see that we get a div class of app container. So you can see that in React we say class name, but in the background it actually generates a normal class on our HTML div here. So now we've got our div of app container, and we've got another div to hold our buttons. We want to put a CSS class of calculator on this div, just to hold the calculator a little bit nicer inside our container. So again, we can't put class like this. We have to put class name and then calculator. And what this is going to do, we're going to use the CSS grid to be able to position our buttons next to each other. So we've got a display of grid, and we're going to say we want 4 columns 50 pixels wide. For our 4th column, what I'm going to do is create another button. We're going to have one of the operators, which is going to be the divide button. So if we pull up the normal standard calculator, what we're trying to do effectively is have 3 buttons, 7, 8, 9, and then a divide, 4, 5, 6, and then times, etc. We're going to lay out the buttons a little bit different from this. And for the 4th button, let's change it from 9 to divide. So we should get the 4 buttons going across here, and we do. And now what we can do is make the next row. Let's copy that in, and that's going to be 7, 8, 9. It's going to be 4, 5, and 6, 4, 5, and 6, and the next operator is going to be star. So we'd now get 2 rows of 4, and we can do 4 more. We can do 1, 2, and 3, and this one is going to be minus. Okay, so it's beginning to look a little bit nicer. But what I want to do next is then define some CSS onto our button here. So let's pop that in there into our CSS panel. We're going to give it a height of 50 pixels, and we're going to change the background color and give it a little bit of a border so it looks a little bit nicer. What would be nice on the operator buttons like divide, multiply, and take away is we're going to give it a different CSS class, and we're going to call it a button class of operator, as you can see here, and just set the color slightly differently. For this one here, this one, and this one, we can change the CSS class. So let's do class name equals operator. And the first thing you'll notice is that suddenly we don't get any CSS being applied. So why is that? Well, we've created a property called class name on our calculator button component, but what's happening is that we're not actually doing anything with it. So we've got button here, but we need to then read in that property of class name and apply it to our button. So that's very easy. All we need to do is simply do the same thing and do class name and just read in our props, class name. And once we do that, we should see that our first button has been changed to grey. Perfect. We can see how we define the property on our parent component here. It gets passed in via the props, and then we can reuse it on our HTML button here by just reading the class name and setting the appropriate attribute. So let's take that CSS class and copy it to our other operators, like that. Perfect. And now we can see we've got the 3 operators all in nice grey. Now let's just finish off the last row of our calculator. So it's a case of just copying this again, and we're going to put the button on the left hand side. At the bottom row is going to be C to enable us to be able to clear the calculator. And then we want a value of 0 in the middle. Then we want a button of equals to be able to get the total from the calculation, and put the final operator of plus. So that means we've got the 4 main operators. Excellent. So you can see our calculator is now beginning to take shape. So the only thing we want to do at the top is create a little display just in order to show the total from our calculator. We can do it very simply. Just simply use a div, and we're going to set a class name of display. And we're going to pop the CSS in just a moment. And for now, we're going to set the value to 0 and finish off that div. And we're just going to paste in the CSS for our display at the top here, just to save ourselves some typing. And now you can see we get a nice looking display at the bottom. Well, maybe not nice looking, but we have a better looking display at the top of the calculator. Okay, so we have now actually more or less visually constructed our calculator in this lesson. Obviously the calculator doesn't actually do anything. In the next lesson, what we're going to do is define some on-click events on each of the buttons so we can start to get the buttons to actually have some functionality. Okay, let's do that in the next lesson and see you there. Hello and welcome back. In the previous lesson, we managed to build this visual representation of our little calculator. But the buttons don't actually currently do anything when we actually click on them. So let's sort that out in this lesson. If you are used to any JavaScript programming, you may be well aware of the HTML event on click and on change, for example. So where we have this button here, you may be expecting to be able to put an on click event, and you will be right. So let's do something like on click. Okay. However, you may notice that if we open up the console, let's just do that, we get an error here. So it says So it says we have an invalid event handler property, and should we mean on click with a capital C. So what is going on here? Well, in React, it wraps all the existing HTML events by capitalizing the second word. So in this particular example, on click, you can see that where we have the HTML event on click with a small c, we have to specify it with a capital C when we are using it in React. And then React will effectively send that event through to the HTML event in the normal way. We just can forget about that. It's just magic that happens in the background. And the only thing we need to worry about is just capitalizing that second word. So for example, if we have an event on change, then we would also need to make the second word on change with a capital C. Alright, so let's now change that to on click with a capital C. Okay, now we see we get another error. It says that it is expecting to have a listener to the on click event. Well, that's fair enough because we haven't actually redirected to a function. Okay, so you may remember that a couple of lessons ago we talked about React callback functions. And we said that the props that's being passed through to our child component can contain a function callback. And that's exactly what we need to do to respond to our onClick events. So what we can do in curly braces is we can say props.onClick. So that means we are expecting a JavaScript function called onClick that will be passed through via our props. Okay, so back in our calc button up here, what we need to do is effectively pass that through as a property. So we can say onClick, and then we need to define a function or a function callback. So where we have our function calculator here, let's define that and say function handle number, just like that. And that, while we're at it, let's do one for our operator. Let's call function handle operator. Alright, so we have two functions. Now on our onClick property, let's just simply point it to our handle number function. So handle number. And for our operator, we can do exactly the same thing. Let's do onClick handle operator. Okay. So what this does, and let's just clear the console for the moment, is when we click the button in our calc button here, it's going to effectively redirect the HTML event on click via the React wrapper. It's going to then just call the function onClick that's defined on our props. It's going to come up here, find the property onClick, and call our handle number function because we specify it here. So in our handle number functions, we can just define what we want to do. So let's, for now, just do an alert and do alert handle number click or something like that. Let's just spell that correctly. There we go. Now what we can do is we press the button, let's say number 7, we get a message saying handle number click. If we press any other button, for example 8, it's not going to do anything because we haven't defined the onClick event on our button number 8. So let's now take our onClick and just simply paste it into all of the other numbers like this. And 1, 2, 3, and then we can do the number 0. There we go. And for our handle operator, let's just do the same thing for our other operators, this one and this one. And let's just do the last operator down here, and we can come back to this C and equals much later. Okay, now if we press the other buttons, for example 9, or let's say number 5, we get our message being appeared. Okay, that's it for this lesson. So we have now managed to learn how to respond to on-click events via React. However, we want to be able to know which button is being pressed. At the moment, we're just getting a message saying handle number click. We have no idea whether it's button 7, button 8, or button 9. So what we need to do is be able to learn how to pass parameters in via the onClick event. So let's learn how to do that in the next lesson. See you there. Hello and welcome back. And in the previous lesson, we learned how to do callback functions in React. And callback functions allowed us to respond to HTML events that happen on our child component. For example, we wanted to respond to the onClick event that the HTML button raises when we click the button. So how exactly did we do this? We created a couple of functions on our parent component called handleNumber and handleOperator. And we pass these callback functions down to our child component by creating this onClick property on each of the instances of our child component. The child component then receives the callback function via the props object, and then when the actual click happens, it will call the callback function all the way up, and it will be received by our function that we defined on our parent object, handleNumber or handleOperator. So the net effect is, when we click the actual button on the calculator, we then get the alert coming up. Okay, and that's pretty much it. This is the same mechanism if you want to have any callback functions in React. So in React, we call this props down and events up. So effectively, all the properties go from the higher up the tree, from the parent component, all the way down to the children. And then when the children want to communicate back to their parent, they do that via the callback functions. We've only got one level of children, so effectively one child, but we could keep on repeating this mechanism all the way down our component tree. Okay, so what do we need to do next? Well, we need to receive the value of the button that's being clicked. So we know, for example, it's button 7 or button 8 that's being called. At the moment, we don't actually know which button is being clicked. When we click 7 or we click 8, we just get the message coming up. So we need some way of being able to pass the value through to this callback function so you can receive it up at the parent. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first step is just to receive the actual creator parameter called a value on our handleNumber function, and we can do the same thing on the handleOperator. Okay, that's step one. We then have to go down to our child components down here, and we need to know, how do we pass the props value through to this onClick here? And the way we do that in React is we do two brackets like this, and then we simply go to our function like props onClick, and then just do the value that we want to pass back, for example 7. So in this case we want to pass back props.value, so we do props.value, and this will say to React that this is a JavaScript expression, so we want to say when the onClick happens, we need to execute the callback function that's come via props.onClick, and we want to pass it the parameter props.value. That will go all the way up to the top here, and it will be received in this value parameter coming into our function here. So if we go handleNumber click, put a colon, and then do plus value, then when we click the button, once it reloads, we can see we get 7 being displayed. Excellent. And it really is as easy as that. So this is one little syntax that you need to remember basically, and etch it into your brain because you'll be using it a lot. So whenever you want to pass a parameter through to the callback function, do it in this format. So open brackets, close brackets, then the arrow, and then the actual parameter like this. Of course, if you wanted to have two parameters, you could simply do something like this, props dot whatever the actual other parameter is, or it could be, for example, primitive like hello, or any other parameter like this. Okay, so we've managed to learn how to pass a parameter back to our callback functions, and we'll take a break here, and when we come back, we're going to learn how to get our calculator to actually do some calculation, and we're going to learn about React State. Okay, see you there. Okay, we have just learned what React State is and how it works within React. But how do we actually implement it in our component? Well, React gives us access to the state via a hook. And a hook is basically a function that is provided by React out of the box. And all the hooks start with the word use. The one that deals with state is called useState. So to access that within React, we do React dot useState, and that function will take, first of all, an initial value for the state. So this is basically what do we want the state to be when the component first initializes. It can take a string or a number, for example, and it can also take an array. In addition to that, it can take a JSON object. So how do we actually initialize this useState function? Well, the very first parameter we need to give it is the initial state for our component. So first of all, to keep things nice and simple, let's give it a value, for example 0. And that's going to be the value of our calculator to appear in the actual display down the bottom here, 0. Now we need to assign that to a constant. So constant, and let's say display equals, and that's going to be the initial value. As well as reading the state, we need to be able to set the state. So you use state function returns us an array, and the first parameter is the actual ability to read the state, i.e. the value, and the second parameter is a function that we can use to actually set the state to a new value. So we can do something like this. We can say set display equals React useState and then the initial value. Okay, so the first parameter, display, will give us the access to the current value of the state, i.e. 0 in this case, and then the function setDisplay will allow us, if we call that, will allow us to update that state variable to the new value. And it's as simple as that. Okay, so what we can do, where we've got the display down here, rather than hard coding the value 0, we can now read it from the actual state. So if we say display like this, we're going to get exactly the same thing. We're going to see 0 rendered in our calculator. If we now change that useState from a 0 to a 1, for example, and let it re-render, then we can see that the display now says 1. So it's reading from our state, which is good. Okay, so the next step is to be able to update this state variable, and we can do that in our handle number. The first thing we're going to try and do is simply take the value being passed into this function and then update our display with the value that's being passed in. So underneath our alert, we can do set display. We're effectively calling the function that we defined here, and we can set it to the new value. So let's set it to the actual value that's being passed in. So value, and we're just going to reset the state back to 0. And now if we look at our calculator and we press the button 7, we can see that the display now gets updated to that value 7. Let's do the same thing for button 8, and now the display goes of 8. So it's easy as that to be able to update the state. And you can see that when the state gets updated, it automatically re-renders our component and works out when the state changes. React automatically realizes that the component needs to re-render, and it works out which DOM element in the virtual DOM needs to update, and then once it does that, it works out what the real element in the DOM is that needs to update, and it updates just that. So you can see as we press the buttons, it's only going to update that one thing there, and we don't get any flicker or anything like that. So all of the rest of the components is not actually being updated at all. So that's pretty good and a very efficient way of updating the DOM. Okay, let's leave it there, and what we're going to do in the next lesson is expand upon our state to be able to start to do our calculation. Okay, let's continue. And in the previous lesson, we got introduced to the React useState hookup here, and it allowed us to basically store a variable which we can use to actually control what's being put in the display here. At the moment, we are storing a number, and then we update that number with the value that's being passed in. But it's passing in a string, and then we're basically boxing it and interpreting it as an integer. So the first thing we need to do is still carry on treating it as a string. And the reason for that is that if we type, for example, 789 in that sequence on a calculator, then we expect to interpret that as 789 and not just keep updating the display with the number that we've actually typed, which is happening at the moment. So how are we going to solve that? Well, what I suggest is that rather than just storing a string here, we need to create a little JSON object. And the reason for that is that we're going to have at the moment two variables. One will be the actual running total of the calculator, and the second will be the current number that we're actually typing in. And then when we press one of the operator buttons, or the equals button down here, we want the display to clear, and then allow the user to type in a new number, but to remember what the previous operation is. That sounds a little bit confusing at the moment. We will see how it works as we build it up. Okay, so let's get started. So in addition to being able to store primitives in a state, we can also store a JSON object. So let's initialize a JSON object like this, and we're going to have at the moment two variables. One will be current, and we're going to set it to 0 as an actual string, and then we're going to have another total like this, which we're also going to set to 0. Okay, that's it for now. So what do we want to do in our function here? What we want to do is when someone presses the button, i.e. they click the number here, we want our current string in our JSON object to effectively concatenate the value that's being passed in. So what do we want to do? Well, first of all, let's get rid of the alert because that's no longer needed. And we want to have a variable that calculates the new string for our display. So let's do a value like this. And then our new value is going to be the current value, so display.current. And we're simply going to append on the actual button that's being pressed, so value. And then for our set display, we need to update that with our JSON object rather than just the actual string. So we need to say JSON object, set the current property to the new value, and we're going to leave the total basically as it already is, so display.total. I think what we're going to do is rather than saying display, let's just change this from display to calc. So we can just do calc and then change that to set calc, and that becomes calc like this, and that also becomes calc, and that is now set calc. So that name there has to match what we've put up in this state here. So set calc. And now on our display here, we need to actually get the JSON object and look at the actual current value. So what we can do is create ourselves a very simple function. We're going to do function render display. All that's going to do is return the calc.current. That's the current value we need to display in our calculator. And we just need to call the function render display. Okay, now our calculator renders, but we don't actually need that function to be precise. We could if we wanted to, or we're a little bit lazy. If we don't have to have it as a function, if we don't want to, we can simply just do calc.current like this, and it will work in exactly the same way. But sometimes it's quite nice to have a little function here if we need to do something with the display. So let's just call a function instead. Okay, so now when we press the button, 7, we can see as we press the button, we get our string actually concatenated together. The only problem is that we've now got this leading 0 because the display initializes to 0 at the beginning, and we simply just append to it the button that's being pressed. So what do we need to do? Well, we need our 0 to disappear the very first time a button is pressed. So that effectively when the initial button is pressed, we want to clear the 0 and simply display 7 and 8. So what we can do is we can create ourselves another property on our calc up here, and we say is initial, and we set it to a value of true. So the very first time this will be true, and we know that the very first button that gets pressed should clear the 0 and effectively just display the actual value. Once the first button's been pressed, we then want to set our initial value back to false, so that we press any more buttons, we don't want the display to actually clear. We just want to concatenate it onto the end of it. So let's go to our handle number function, and we're going to say if calc initial, so if calc is not initial, should I say, So effectively, we don't want it to concatenate on the very first time, we simply just want it to replace the number that's there. If it's the second time and above, we then want to concatenate it. So we want to wrap this in our if statement. Okay. The very first time is going to take the value, assign it to new value, and simply just update the calculator. So let's give that a go. If we now press 7, we can see that our 0 disappears and we have 7. If we now press another button, the actual string starts to concatenate together. So we can type all sorts of numbers like this. Excellent. So you can see how the calculator is beginning to take some shape. Okay, and once we've got this if statement, we just need to set our initial value back to false. So where we've got set calc here, we do isInitial and set that to false. So the next time we press a button, it's going to come into here and append the actual number to the current string that's held here. Let's give that a go. And you can see that the first time I press a button, the 0 disappears and we just get the value of the button I pressed. And as we click other buttons, it's now concatenating the new numbers to the ones that's in the display. So you can see our calculators are beginning to operate a little bit like a calculator. So we're getting somewhere. But of course, it's not doing anything particularly grand, because if I press these operators, it's not going to do anything because we've got an empty function here. So let's deal with that and work out how we're going to do some calculation in the next lesson. In the last lesson, we managed to find a way of being able to get our calculator to concatenate numbers together as we type them. But at the moment, we haven't actually implemented an actual calculation for when we press one of these operator buttons. So we're going to do that in this lesson. So what we need to do is basically have a little function called doCalculation. And when the handle operator function is called, when we're pressing one of these buttons, we want to then call our calculation function and pass in the operator that's being actually pressed. So this means, by operator I mean this multiply, divide, and this minus down here. Okay, so let's do a function, and let's call it doCalculation. And then when we press the handle operator button, we actually want it to form the calculation with the number that's previously on the calculator. So for example, the calculator initially starts with 0. We then press a button like 5, for example. If we then press one of these operators like plus, we want to take the value of the previous calculator, which is like 0, and then add this number onto it. So it would be 0 plus 5, and we want to then update our calculator to say 5. We then press another number, for example, say 6. If we then press another operator, say plus again, we want to take that value of 5 and then add the new number to it, in which case 6, and the calculator then wants to add that together, and the total needs to be updated to 11. So that's quite a lot for our little calculator to do in our little calculation function. So first of all, we just want to call our calculation function. So the responsibility of our calculation function is simply to work out what the new total is. And then when we press the handle operator button, we want to get that new total. Let's say const total. And then we want to update the total inside our state function with the new total. So you want to do set calc. It's going to be another JSON object. So then what do we need to do? Well, we need to update the total with the total coming back from our calculation function. So our calculation function is going to return a number, which is the total. So we need to store that, and we then need to update it as a string. So we will do total to string. And then what we want to do is be able to update the display with the new total. So to do that, I want to say current total to string. So we're keeping a running total in this variable here, and this property here, or this variable, is going to actually just keep tabs on what needs to be displayed in the calculator. We then need to set our initial flag again to make sure it doesn't get overwritten. So initial, and set that to true. And the reason is, once we press an operator, we want our display to clear and then start displaying a new number. Let's now go to our doCalculation function and work out what we need to do here. We need to be able to do the calculation based on the operator that's just been pressed. So in our handle operator, the best way of doing it is to store that in our state as well. So let's go to our definition up here and have a property called pre-op, so i.e. the operation that just got pressed the moment ago. Let's set it to empty string. When we first initialize the calculator, there is currently no operation in progress. And then when we go to our handle operation function, the value here will be the operator that's just been pressed. And we can simply update our state with that value. So we can do pre-op and set that to value. Okay, so this is going to hold something like plus or minus or multiply. That then becomes available in our calculation function. So we can now do switch calc.preop. And now we can have a series of cases. So we can say case plus, we need to do something there, and then case minus, and then do a calculation, and then do two more cases, one for the multiply, and then one for the divide, like that. And now we can do the actual calculation. We need to first of all get the total out of the calculator, and we need to convert it from a string to an integer. So let's do let total equals parseInt calc.total. So we've now got the total, the current total in the calculator as an integer, and we can do total equals itself plus the value that's being passed in. So the easiest way of doing that is total plus equals, which is effectively the same thing as doing total equals total plus, so it's shorthand, so plus equals parseInt calc.current. So that's the addition done. We can do the same thing for the subtraction and just change it from plus to a minus. And then for the multiply, same thing, but make that multiply. And then for divide, again, the same thing, and make that divide. We then simply need to return to our calling function the actual new total. So return total, like so. So again, the only responsibility for this function is just to calculate the total. It's not updating the state or doing anything like that. That's the responsibility of this handle operator function. So we should get the new total returned from our doCalculation function. And then we update the state. And then we should actually have nearly a working calculator. And to keep the switch happy, we need to provide a default. And the default can simply just take the current value of the calculator. So let's do default and then total equals parseInt calc.current. That should keep it happy. And now while we're here, let's implement the actual clear button. So that's nice and easy. All we need to do is just reset everything back to its default values. So let's create a function and call it function handle clear. And we simply update the state and with our initial values at the top here. So let's just borrow all of that to there. And then say set calc and pass that object in. So we're just going to clear the calculator. And on our clear button down, where is it? Here. We can simply have an on click and say on click equals handle clear, like so. And we might as well do the 0 button. So let's just say on click, actually just copy the one we've got here, save myself typing. And then we've just got the equals button. So let's do the equals button. And to do that, I think all we need to do is simply call the doCalculation. And that's going to come into here. It's going to go to the default because the equals won't be handled by any of these cases. And it's simply just going to output the current total that we've already calculated from a previous operation. So let's pop the function here and say function handle equals. And all that does is do calculation, like so. And of course, we need to get the actual value out of that and say let total equals do calculation. And we just need to update the calculator again, like we've done up here, and change that to equals. And now we should have more or less a functioning calculator. Let's do 3 plus 6 plus 9. And it's working, but not quite. Do the clear button, it clears. So that's functioning okay. Let's do 30, and let's do a minus, let's do 20 equals, and that is causing an error, as we can see down here. So we've got a little bit of a mistake. Let's open up the console and seeing what's going on here. Props click is not a function. So of course we've forgotten to actually put on the onClick on our equals button. So let's do onClick equals handle equals. Okay, so we can try our calculator out. Let's do 30 plus 20. So that's all working nicely. Let's try the equals button and nothing happens. So it should say 50, but it's not. Let's just try cracking on and see where the operators still work. 2 plus, and let's add another 10 on. And we can see that we are getting some display, but things aren't quite right. We are getting some sort of update as we're pressing the buttons. So this is a perfect opportunity to learn about how to debug React apps. So let's take a break here and let's work out what we've done wrong in the next lesson. Okay, welcome back. And we have nearly finished our calculator. It's almost working, but it has a few little bugs in it, mainly around being able to calculate the total when we press the equals button. So what we're going to do in this lesson is learn how to debug React apps. It's exactly the same way as you would debug any other JavaScript apps. There's no particular difference. So you can put in your debugger statements, for example. So let's put a debugger in here. And let's also put a console log. And let's log out this state. So we can say console log and then calc. And in this actual site on this code pen, we've got access to a console down here. So we can click that, and then anything coming up in our console will appear down here. But in addition to that, we also have the built-in browser debugger as well. So let's first of all see what happens in our console. Let's make this a little bit smaller so we can see what's going on. And let's do 10, and then press plus, and expand this console. We can see our state says the current value is 10. Well, that's what's in the display. And the current total is 0. If we then add another value and do 20 and hit plus, we can see that our current value is 20, that's in the display, plus the previous value is 10. But you may have noticed something, and that our operator has got lost here. We've only got 3 values on our state, and we should have 4 values on our state. So let's try and figure out what's going on there. Let's open up the developer console by going to the 3 dots, and then more tools, and then developer tools. And let's press another button. Let's make these windows a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on. Let's do 10 again, and then hit plus, and we hit a debugger. So we've managed to pull out the value 20 out of our current total, and we can now step through the code, and you can see we have got to the default. And the reason why our default is we're getting undefined on this property called preop. So somewhere we are clearing our state, or we are clearing that particular property on our state. So that's the problem. Let's figure out where we're doing that. So there's only a few places where we update the state. One is here, and we can see that we are setting the pre-op here, so we're not doing anything wrong there. But immediately above it, we are only setting 3 values. We're not setting the pre-op. So what happens is that when we go to set the state object, it takes this object here and overwrites the previous object. And because we don't specify the property, it's basically going to set that to undefined. So all we need to do to fix that is simply set it back to itself and do pre-op and then calc.preop like this. And while we're here, we can double check in the equals button and we can see that we've currently set it there. But what we're doing here is we're actually doing a bit of code duplication, because we're actually doing exactly the same thing as we are doing right up here where it says handle operator. So there's particularly no reason why we've got this separate function to do that. Why don't we just call the existing handle operator and just pass in the equals, because when it comes down to here, it's going to effectively fall into this anyway. So let's get rid of this function. And where we've got our equals button here, we can change that to say handle operator, and it will pass in the equals, and then all should be good. Let's just clear the console, and we can shut that down for the moment. And let's just get rid of our debug statements, so not in our way, that and that. Okay, there we go, and let's give it a go again. So 10 plus 20 equals 30. Now we can do another one, plus 20 equals 50, minus 5 plus 6 equals 51. Excellent. Let's try and be a bit braver and do some multiplication. So 51 times 2 equals 102. It looks like it's working, guys. And let's divide that by maybe 5 equals 20.4. Excellent. And let's add 6 onto that, 26. We can clear it down and we can do a few more. 56 times 89 equals 4984. So there we go, guys. I think we can congratulate ourselves in making our first little React project, and we have a little functioning calculator. And we've learned quite a lot, haven't we? So with that, let's move on and go to the module summary. Congratulations for reaching the end of this module and this mini project. We have achieved quite a lot in such a short period of time. From no knowledge of React, we have now made our first little React application, and we've learnt a lot along the way. We've learnt how to build components and about component design. We have also learnt how React renders components and how it communicates between parent and child components using React props and callback functions. We have also learnt about how to manage data in React by using the useState hook. We should be proud of what we have achieved in such a short period of time. Well done, guys. Okay, let's review our little application. We have implemented a very basic calculator. And there's quite a lot of things we could do to improve this little application. And I'm sure you can think of many things. But for example, how about things like decimal numbers and maybe implementing a memory function or introducing other buttons like percentages, etc. Basically, everything we can do in a normal standard calculator, we could have a go at trying to implement on our own. But don't stop here. Have a go and try and implement these ideas yourself and expand upon what we have built here. I hope you have enjoyed this little project. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, or if you want to just simply show me how you have improved our little project. I'd love to see what you do. I hope you are keen to learn more about React, and I am looking forward to teaching you more. So let's expand our knowledge of React even further by moving on to the next project. See you there.